Jesus, meek and humble of heart, clothe us with compassion, kindness, and humility. Make us want to be patient with everyone.
Lord, renew us in your grace.
Teach us to be true neighbors to all in trouble and distress, and so to imitate you, the Good Shepherd.
Lord, renew us in your grace.
May the Blessed Virgin Mary, your mother, pray for all those vowed to a life of virginity, that they may deepen their dedication to you and to the Church.
Lord, renew us in your grace.
Grant us the gift of your mercy. Forgive us our sins.
Lord, renew us in your grace.
I invite you now to stand and join me in praying the words that Jesus himself gave us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And the power and the glory, now and ever, to the ages of ages. Amen. Lord, make this Lenten observance of the suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ bring us to the full joy of Easter. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Let us go in the peace of Christ.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you.
The timing was perfect. We have 5 minutes to stretch, bathroom break, whatever anyone needs to do before we begin our first session. So let's break for 5 minutes and come back at 10.
And we look very much forward to her presentation on unity and diversity.
Good morning. I tend to have a very loud projected voice, so if I need to turn the volume down on this, just give me the high sign, because I get excited sometimes. So I want to thank the Huffington Ecumenical Institute for inviting me, and more specifically Deacon Nicholas. I feel quite honored to be here speaking about that which I am passionate about, which is liturgical music. After all the wonderful presentations yesterday, I hope that what I have to say to you will be edifying and lead us forward in this process that we're all in. I am trying to work dual technologies this morning, and I pray that with the help of Holy Father Patrick that all will go well. I will be presenting my thoughts this morning about the state of liturgical music in the Orthodox Church as far as things are cross-jurisdictionally from my perspective as founder and president of an organization called Psalm, but also my personal reflections of being an Orthodox Church musician here in the 21st century and my experiences in a thriving parish that has much going on and is very pan-Orthodox in its musical language.
just lock it if you want. I guess so it doesn't tell.
Now, I could keep playing music forever, beautiful, diverse music, but actually you asked me here to speak, so I guess I should do that. So I'm Irish Catholic by heritage, so getting to speak about liturgical music on St. Patrick's Day is quite an honor for me. 25 years ago, on the feast of St. Leo the Great, February 18th, I became an Orthodox Christian. And that was after a brief stint in evangelicalism when I was in college. So I've had a diverse forming of my Christian faith through all those different things and experienced music in all those different ways. 25 years ago, on the feast of St. Leo the Great, February 18th, I became an Orthodox Christian. And that was after a brief stint in evangelicalism when I was in college. So I've had a diverse forming of my Christian faith through all those different things and experienced music in all those different ways. I sang many a folk mass in my high school years. When I discovered Orthodoxy in my early 20s, I knew in my heart of hearts that this was where I needed to be in my life. And I discovered what I had been missing in evangelicalism, which was the sacred, the sacraments, and the beautiful. And my life as a church musician is all about beauty and how beauty brings people to Christ. Not alone, of course. I had no idea at that time, in my early 20s, 8 months pregnant when I was chrismated with my first child, that what my journey would be and what my place would become in the Orthodox world. 6 years after that, at the behest of my priest, my partner in all things liturgical music and Shep, and I went to the Summer Institute at St. Vladimir's Seminary. This opened up a whole new world to me in both music and theology. We were so inspired by that and met who would become long enduring friendships of church musicians, Mark Bailey, Vlad Morrison, Father Sergei Glagolev, and many, many others. Out of that institute in 1993, yes, I'm dating myself, but it's okay, was conceived an organization called Psalm. And when we first organized this, the acronym meant Pan-Orthodox liturgical musicians and singers, or singers and liturgical musicians. Got my I'm dyslexic. Later on, when we did all our fancy corporation and all that, it got changed to Society, Pan-Orthodox Society for the Advancement of Liturgical Music, which the board of directors has since rescinded because really we're not about the music, but about the people who create the music. And this organization was formed for church musicians so that they could come together. The motto that we adopted was from a, where'd it go? And when we began to learn from one another, the faith and the divine singing began to spread throughout the land. And this quote, I think, is very appropriate for this conference as well, because it's about learning from each other so that we can then move forward together. This quote is very much a reflection of what my life in the church has been. It's been about bringing people together to worship, to sing, to learn about the richness of the faith and the musical history of the worship in a variety of traditions and cultures. And then finding the commonality in those differences. From the outset, Psalm was a grassroots organization. We had no large plans of coming under any particular bishop or higher organization. It was just really meant so that church musicians had an avenue to get together to talk. We began to meet regularly. We created something that has lived on this day called the Liturgical Singing Seminar that happens in California every February-ish. Barring maybe 2 years since 1994, we've had a conference that's specifically about Orthodox liturgical music. We also published a periodical, more than a newsletter, less than a journal, called Psalm Notes, about 16 to 24 pages with new articles, newly written. Deacon Nicholas was a contributor in one issue, but also then bringing words from the fathers that pertained to liturgical music, trying to get sort of a common basis for where we were moving forward in liturgical music. The most visible manifestation of our organization has been the E-list that continues to be frequented by people. We're in the process now of trying to create a new website that's much more 21st century, more social media, where sharing of things can happen easier, and hopefully bringing in the younger liturgical musicians that are up and coming. But as we met together and as we got to know one another, certain common messages and themes emerged. One of the big ones was the need for more education among liturgical musicians. Very often in a parish, the person who's doing the music happens to be the only one who knows how to read notes on a page. So they might be a clarinetist or a bass player, but maybe not a singer. And certainly with little or no theological education. Putting together an Orthodox service is not for the weak of heart. It's a complex act where you have to sort of know much. So education became sort of a big part of what we felt that we needed to do to bring people together. And people were frightened by that, but I'll get to that in a moment. For now, a little more music. The next couple of samples of music I'm going to play for you are all the same text, but in settings by various traditions. And the first selection, there's 4 samples, are from the Nativity Byzantine, the Nativity canon for the Feast of the Nativity. And the second is God is with us. So let's take a listen.
Sing to the Lord.
unto God is with us. Nope, go back. So each of these samples, as you can tell, are widely different from one another. And in certain places, if used in worship, would be quite foreign to the ears of the worshiping faithful. You bring Byzantine chant into a Slavic church and they kind of go, what is that? And that's Christmas? Or for that matter, you throw Kostalski Znanomany chant 4-part arrangements into a Byzantine situation, and they're also going like, what is that? That's not the chant that was written by the angels on Mount Athos. So what's important here, and what I discovered through working with people across the country, was that it's very important to really understand what is the ethos, the musical ethos and heritage that worshiping community is used to worshiping in. Because that is how people have learned to pray. And if you try to take them out of their comfort zone, it becomes more of a distraction than a way to help them enter into prayer. What works in one place fabulously would be anathema somewhere else. So the people who, parishes who use these various different melodies, these are beloved to them, as are the texts that they sing, which I'm not going to get into, but people get very attached to the words that they sing too. So throwing new translations or trying to change the style of their prayer, and Catholics, with all that's been going on lately, you understand that trying to change the style of the prayer distracts them from actually entering into worship with their full hearts. The music is there to help engage the gathered faithful in prayer and enhance the liturgical moment without calling attention to itself. Now, some of you might say when you heard that Alamanov canon, well, gosh, who can pray to that? And yet, I will tell you right now, that's how my church prays. For Christmas, if we don't get the Alamanov canon, it's not Christmas. Whereas for someone from the Byzantine tradition, that would just be like, fine in a concert, but not in my church. So each jurisdiction that we've been talking about has their own sort of musical heritage. But it's not just the music of the jurisdiction that's important. It's that musical history and heritage of each particular parish. So at a micro level, what's happening in a particular parish may vary widely, even within a particular jurisdiction. Radical movement outside of the ethos of that parish, as I say, takes people away. Dr. Cohen in his talk yesterday talked about the particulars of a situation, of a faith, and this music is one of those particulars. So the challenge for a liturgical musician is not to select music for worship that they like. Doesn't matter whether or not I like it. It helps, but doesn't matter. It must serve the liturgical form and function. It needs to match the skill levels of the singers that are there, and it needs, most importantly, to reflect the ethos of the community so that they can enter into prayer. What's tricky is when something changes in a parish that requires a change. For example, a liturgical musician learning that, wow, the antiphons should actually happen in a particular way, or the Trisagion was meant to be a procession, and this is not, whatever it is. As they learn the liturgics, then the trick is, how do I make a change to bring my community forward without upsetting their path and their prayer? And so change must happen slowly. I have a rule: I don't change anything unless what I'm changing it for is way better musically, that I know the people will embrace. So, back to Psalm. We realized early on in our journey that we needed to embrace the fullness of each of the traditions and respect those. We often encountered a jurisdictional wall. Sometimes that wall was thicker than other times. Some musicians easily embraced the idea of coming together and learning and sharing together. Others felt threatened, either because of their lack of training or because they perceived they were the only ones who suffered from the problems they had in their parish. Often musical leadership in the archdiocese felt that we were going to try to change the way they did things, that we were going to try to impose some particular standard. Of course, that was never what we were interested in. We were just interested in dialoguing and a sharing of experience, shared understanding. So often parish members feel isolated. How many church musicians never get to go to church outside their own community? Because they're the only ones who can do the services. So they feel very isolated, and they don't have the opportunity to experience other things. So we wanted to help support those people, provide training and education, sometimes for simple things as, how do I give pitches? Other times, how do I put together a service that I'm not familiar with? We've never done matins. How do you do matins? We had to work towards understanding and acceptance of various differences. With that understanding and acceptance came trust and of greater ability to support one another. Trust allowed folks to start seeing the commonalities rather than the differences. Differences are much easier to see. Commonalities are often harder to see because we get caught up in what's different. At one of our early board meetings, one of our board of directors said, I remember him sort of almost jumping up on the table at St. Vlad's and going, "When we come together, good things happen." And as silly as it was at the moment, and even as silly as I say it right now, that was actually a turning point because it was about that coming together that was so important. That's why a conference like this is so important. Coming together and learning from one another. We're currently in a little bit of a hiatus after having a fabulous national conference in 2006. The lives of the major players in Psalm changed dramatically, and we've kind of pulled back, but we're in the process of trying to put together another national conference next summer. It's hard in this it's harder now than it was 10 years ago. The jurisdictional situation is harder now than it was then. So But I've not been idle. I have a wonderful website with my partner in crime, Ann Shep, seraphim6.com, which is a place to find wonderful settings of music in English in nicely published form so that church musicians don't have to read off of chicken scratch. I haven't talked about translation because that's a huge topic. It's a huge topic. Whole nother conference, Deacon Nicholas. But the jurisdictional quagmire is a problem. So, in conclusion, hearkening back to what Peter said in his keynote yesterday about the blossoming of music on this land, you know, that it would take a decade or so. Well, and now it's been a couple centuries. There actually are people who are beginning to write, and it's important. I'm out of time, so I won't play my last little 3 examples of newly composed music for the Orthodox Church. Everyone says, do it anyway. Okay, I'll do it really quickly. I'll go really quick. So these are people who are writing within the tradition, but these are new melodies. The Holy Spirit is actually alive and well and working in the hearts of church musicians. He didn't stop functioning 100 years ago. And finally, an example from Roman Herko, who's just an amazing composer. These aren't based on chant, but they sound like chant. And they're written to fit the English. Thank you very much.
Seraphim, the number 6 or SIX?
Seraphim6.com.
Thank you.
All right, you get it.
Alice, thank you again. It's really lovely. Thank you. Our next presenter is Tony Alonso. I've known Tony for a number of years here at LMU, primarily in his capacity as the director of music within campus ministry. Also, Tony suffered through our master's in theological studies and did so with great distinction. Tony is a nationally renowned composer and liturgical musician, and I'm very, very pleased to invite him to speak to us on his topic, In Splendid, Varied Ways, Unity and Diversity in Post-Conciliar Liturgical Song. Tony.
Not only did I suffer through a class of Dr. Sykers, but also Deacon Nicholas led me through an independent study. So it's a delight to be able to share some thoughts, and a little bit intimidating as well, in front of former professors. Thank you again, Alice, for the wonderful music and thoughts you shared with us this morning. John Vitfleet, who's the director of the Calvin Institute for Music, Liturgical Music, has noted that when Christians gather to discuss music and worship, we often come for 3 reasons: to be affirmed in our own views, to convince others of our well-founded positions, or to amass ammunition to do that better in the future. Debates about what should be sung in Christian liturgical worship are not particularly new. Controversies about what forms and words, if any, should be used to sing about God, and what, if any, accompaniment should be used in the process, remain a long part of our documented history. Indeed, as early as the 4th century, we find polemics expressing concern for the ways in which particular musical styles are thought to be dangerous and closely associated with immorality. In the blowing of the tibia, they puff out their cheeks. They lead obscene songs. They raise a great din with the clapping of sabella, under the influence of which a multitude of other lascivious souls abandon themselves to bizarre movements of the body. One need not look far to find such passionate feelings about particular styles of music in worship today, found in blogs and music conferences and so forth. In this particular presentation, I argue that privileging a particular musical style as normative to post-conciliar Roman Catholic worship has served as a barrier to the selection of music which takes seriously the full, conscious, and active participation of the liturgical assembly in the rites. First, I want to offer a brief overview of the dominant principles to be applied to the selection of Roman Catholic liturgical music as articulated by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Second, I argue that despite these thoughtful and nuanced principles, conversations about music in Catholic liturgy have been dominated instead by the privileging of particular musical styles in a way that obscures participation. Third, I want to examine 3 reasons why conversations about styles seem to dominate the contemporary conversation. And I want to note also that the choice of this topic came out of some helpful conversations I had with both Alice and Deacon Nicholas about some points of resonance, perhaps issues that we both struggle with, deal with in our own traditions. So I share them from my own perspective as a Roman Catholic pastoral musician, but I hope they might also resonate with Orthodox and members of other Christian denominations. Since the implementation of the Second Vatican Council's liturgical reforms, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has issued 4 documents on the use of music in Roman Catholic liturgy. The first, written in 1968, became the basis of the 3 documents that followed. And it's particularly notable and laudable that these documents have largely been hailed as a model for the way in which U.S. bishops can successfully collaborate with lay and ordained experts in a particular field to create documents that are both theologically grounded and pastorally helpful. Indeed, Ed Foley notes the following about the most recent of these documents. The process of public and private consultation surrounding the writing of this document needs to be held up as a true symbol of active participation in the liturgy of the Church. Many voices and perspectives were invited into the shaping of the document, and while there may not always be musical or liturgical agreement among those voices on every aspect, who could deny that the process of its formulation contributed to the singing with one voice that is the vision of Christian worship? While time constraints and the particular focus of my topic don't permit a full exploration of these documents, I want to focus on 3 criteria which remain consistent among at least 3 of them, and they become a significant focus of scholarly and pastoral reflection on American Roman Catholic liturgical music in the last 30 plus years. The musical, liturgical, and pastoral judgments to be applied to liturgical compositions. And while their nascent form is found as early as the 1968 document, I want to focus on their most recent articulation in the 2007 document, Sing to the Lord, which states them as follows. In judging the appropriateness of music for liturgy, one will examine its liturgical, pastoral, and musical qualities. Ultimately, however, these 3 judgments are but aspects of one evaluation, which answers the question, is this particular piece of music appropriate for this use in this particular liturgy? All 3 judgments must be considered together, and no individual judgment can be applied in isolation from the other 2. Sing to the Lord articulates the liturgical judgment first, inviting the question, is this composition capable of meeting the structural and textual requirements set forth by the liturgical books for this particular rite? It goes on to note that the liturgical judgment demands a consideration of the elements of the rite itself, the balance among the various liturgical elements so that less important elements do not overshadow more important ones, and that the textual elements of a particular piece, quote, include the ability of a musical setting to support the liturgical text, to convey meaning faithful to the teaching of the church. The second is the pastoral judgment. The pastoral judgment takes into consideration the actual community gathered to celebrate at a particular place and time. It asks the question, does a musical composition promote the sanctification of the members of the liturgical assembly by drawing them closer to the holy mysteries being celebrated? Does it strengthen their formation in faith by opening their hearts to the mystery being celebrated on this occasion or in this season? Is it capable of expressing the faith that God has planted in their hearts and summoned them to celebrate? This section acknowledges the diversity of liturgical assemblies in the United States today, stating that factors such as age, culture, language, and education must also be considered. Further, it suggests that the forms of compositions used will often depend on those ways in which a particular group finds it easiest to join their hearts and minds to the liturgical action. The authors are concerned that the experience of a particular assembly be carefully considered, quote, lest forms of musical expression that are alien, and this connects well with what Alice was saying, lest forms of musical expression that are alien to their way of worshiping be introduced precipitously. Finally, the musical judgment invites us to consider whether this composition has the necessary aesthetic qualities that can bear the weight of the mysteries celebrated in the liturgy. It asks the question, is this composition technically, aesthetically, and expressively worthy? Sing to the Lord insists that this judgment requires musical competency, and that only artistically sound music will be effective and endure over time. It says to admit the liturgy, the cheap, the trite, or the musical cliche often found in secular popular songs is to cheapen the liturgy, to expose it to ridicule, and to invite failure. This section draws, however, a distinction between style and artistic expression, arguing that the Church has not adopted any particular style of art as her own. She has admitted styles from every period in keeping with natural characteristics and conditions of peoples and the needs of the various rites. In short, it insists that all styles may have a proper place in Roman Catholic worship. Sing to the Lord is not without its imperfections. Indeed, it lacks important criteria for many of its assertions. For instance, how does one go about determining what music is technically, aesthetically, and expressively worthy? Further, who determines who the competent musicians are who might determine what is trite or cheap or cliche? Despite these and many other questions the document poses without offering a necessarily clear criteria, the strength of the document is that it provides a nuanced, thoughtful, and integrated approach for the selecting of Roman Catholic worship, music for Roman Catholic worship, which takes seriously the profound, diverse cultural terrain of the United States. And yet, it is striking how infrequently one experiences music, regardless of style or quality, which reflects these judgments in any clear way in actual pastoral practice. For instance, music which lacks any obvious connection to the scriptures of the day or the imagery of the liturgical season. Musical forms which highlight the choral ensemble, organist, praise band, or soloist, while the role of the assembly is at best an afterthought during liturgical rites which, by their very nature, demand their participation. Or music in a variety of styles, which is too elaborated for any untrained musician to sing. Instead, discussion about Roman Catholic music has moved away from the liturgical demands of participation and the structural demands of liturgical rites, and has instead largely centered around musical style, or at times, even more narrowly, on personal preferences for individual composers or songs. Indeed, the decades immediately following the council were marked by contrasts between the Mass Alice played at, the so-called folk Mass, versus the so-called traditional Mass. And I say so-called because none of the music at the folk Mass was really folk Mass in the traditional sense. And a lot of the music sung at the so-called traditional Mass was actually Protestant hymnody, which really wasn't part of our tradition. But nevertheless, in the modern scene, we could add to these today Sunday night life teen Mass with heavily musical influences from the praise and worship genre, the chant mass, the children's mass, and many others. I choose to focus on this privileging of particular styles for two reasons. First, it has served as an obstacle to a unified, coherent vision of the role of music in Roman Catholic worship. While style can and should be a worthy part of the conversation, if it dominates the conversation or becomes the lens through which we look at the liturgical rites, it can obscure the fundamental nature of liturgical music, which is to enable the gathered assembly not to sing at the liturgy, but to actually sing the liturgy. My second reason for focusing on this particular issue is, as I said at the beginning, it seems to be a point of resonance with many notable Orthodox liturgical musicians. Indeed, in a thoughtful article on the future of liturgical music in the Orthodox Church in America, Mark Bailey writes about the barriers such preferences can present to any unified vision of music's role in liturgy. He says this: when liturgical musicians are trapped into particular favored styles, periods, and genres of music, when they think and work in musical vacuums, one unaware of the processes of the other, when liturgy inadvertently becomes a tool for musicological rediscovery or experimentation in worship, when the music itself distracts from liturgy by the power of its own self-expression, when the concern for preserving cultural heritage dominates the choice of repertoire, when musicians ignore the pulse and nature of worship so as not to lose treasured musical practices and settings, when the overall consideration of liturgy fails to frame the entire musical enterprise, then movement toward unity ceases. So there seems to be some consensus that entrenched positions about styles, what styles should be normative to liturgical worship, can be a stumbling block to liturgical participation. Yet I want to move beyond merely describing the problem to examining why this seems to be the case, particularly in post-conciliar Roman Catholic worship. First, even among many advocates of the participatory nature of the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council, liturgical repertoire has often privileged musical, emotional, and cultural expression at the expense of participation. One of my mentors, Gabe Huck, wrote this plainly about the role of music in post-conciliar liturgy. Saying musical liturgy is like saying multicolored rainbow. It is liturgy's nature to be sung. Our song is something without which there would be no liturgy. When we come expecting to do and not to watch, we will need our music. Song becomes an extra, only nice or only pretty, when we come for inspiration, entertainment, or obligation, or education. But if we come to do, then song is central to the whole undertaking. And yet, many Roman Catholics seem content with inspiration, entertainment, or education, whether or not there is the kind of full conscious and active participation the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy demands. Composer John Bell keenly notes that some of those who, in a previous era, were keen to dispense the tyranny of the organist and choir because they did not let the people sing, are now fulfilling the arrogant and elitist roles they previously denounced, as the worship of God's people becomes dominated by amplification, which highlights the performer's skills, and overhead projectors, which forbid any deep engagement with the text being sung. Second, the tension between individualism and the demands of a communal tradition of worship are frequently at the center of debates over musical style, and the former often wins out. Bruce Morrill has noted that the liturgy is a site of conflict between the market-driven values of private possession, individual convenience, and personal comfort. The relationship between consumer sensibilities and those required for stewarding of the Christian tradition are profound. And the impact of consumerism should not be associated only with those who embrace today's popular music styles in liturgical worship. Vincent Miller's work in Consumption and Religion has argued that even so-called traditionalist retrievals are not only innovative, but also deeply contemporary. Miller writes about the ways in which traditionalism is deeply marked by the contemporary, in that it easily conforms to the logic of nostalgia, Like souvenirs brought home from distant lands, the religion of the past is excised from its cultural political context and used to decorate the everyday life of our own time. Third, debates about style, and this is a little more positive, debates about style often consume us because music is an inescapably bodily activity with strong connections to our emotional life. As Don Saliers has noted, whatever affects us spiritually or mentally also resonates within our bodies. Indeed, in his Confessions, Augustine writes passionately about the deeply expressive quality of music. The tears that flowed from me when I heard your hymns and canticles, for the sweet singing of your church moved me deeply. The music surged in my ears, truth seeped into my heart, and my feelings of devotion overflowed. Saliers has argued that controversies about style emerge precisely because music, played, sung, and heard, remains both emotionally powerful and yet mysteriously ephemeral, always passing away in linear time, yet always fusing past, future, and present. The way in which ordered sound can express our emotions and even shape ourselves and our world is a profoundly complex topic. And yet, it is crucial to acknowledge this reality because it challenges us to realize that personal musical tastes, or as you said, the ethos of a particular community, and the complicated associations music creates are not irrelevant, even as we consider how they might be a challenge to communal worship. To conclude, I want to emphasize that I believe style has a fundamentally crucial role, contrary to how it might sound, enabling or disabling a particular assembly's participation. For instance, privileging the European hymn in a Mexican-American parish in East Los Angeles, even if the words are translated into Spanish, would be like speaking a foreign musical language that would likely not enable that community to enter into the liturgical rites fully, consciously, and actively. My concern is when style becomes the primary concern and issues of participation and liturgical structure become secondary. Roman Catholic liturgical music need not be marked by unanimity of style or even repertoire. However, it should be marked by and evaluated for its clear and consistent privileging of full conscious and active participation, rarely present in the music of post-conciliar worship. In his article on the future of liturgical music in Orthodox America, Bailey notes, one may then ask, what about beauty in music? The question presumes, however, that beauty, realized through choral or solo singing, is the only form, or the most effective form of beauty that should evolve out of the liturgical gathering. Yet when the faithful, as the unified body of Christ, raise their voices collectively in supplication and in joyful praise of God, beauty exists as well. I agree with Bailey that pastoral musicians must not only avoid equating beauty with music from a particular favored style, period, or genre, but we must also avoid equating beauty with the performance of the leaders, and instead fall in love with the voice of the singing assembly in all of its splendid and varied ways. Thank you.
Tony, thank you very much for your remarks. At this point, I'd like to invite Tony and Alice to have a conversation with each other based on what they've heard, and then we'll open it up to a conversation of the whole.
First, I need to get to know Tony better because I think that we are very like-minded. I had to laugh a little bit at the first quote. I think it was from a 4th century thing about how music was affecting people, because if you look back at the early 20th century, that quote could have been stated about ragtime music and the horrors that it was going to wreak upon society. So that's not church music, but there are many quotes very similar to that about the terribleness of ragtime. So I was actually most struck at the end of your talk when you were talking about the power of the gathered assembly singing, and anyone who has ever been in a place where the Orthodox sing "The Angel Cried" during Pascha, and every person from 3 years old to 103 sing full voice. There is nothing more beautiful than that, even when it's grossly out of tune. There is something just so spiritual about that gathered assembly entering into that. And, you know, I didn't talk much about getting the gathered assembly to sing, but that is something I'm very passionate about. So.
Yeah, I was thinking about how the evaluation of liturgical music that happens sounds really low. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Maybe I need to just talk higher.
That one was just really
okay.
loud.
To a tenor?
Sure. I was thinking about the evaluation of liturgical music that takes place in most Roman Catholic communities goes something like, boy, the choir sounded great today. Or, gee, I really liked that song that the soloist sang in the preparation of the gifts. And rarely does the evaluation, even among, members of the parish staff or whatever, revolve around the participation of the assembly. And, like you probably, I have the opportunity to participate in a lot of national conferences. Same thing. Evaluation is, boy, that music was really full of life. Or, wasn't it great that you got, that it was so diverse? But whether the actual participation is happening or not, nobody seems to raise these questions.
I would always much rather hear than, oh, that was a beautiful piece the choir sang this morning. I would much rather hear, thank you for really bringing me to worshiping this morning. I felt so touched by the Holy Spirit, or that I don't really care how beautiful they think it is, if it doesn't lead them to a closer connection with each other and with Christ.
I did have one question. Is there, because I know in some corners of the Catholic Church, there's a movement towards a common repertoire. Like I think of in Australia, bishop there started banning hymns and said, no, we're only going to sing these hymns. Is there any movement towards, a very different situation for you, but towards more unity actually in terms of repertoire?
Within certain jurisdictional and archdioceses, there is much more of a push that way. Some jurisdictions, you don't use music that is not specifically approved by bishops for use in worship. I think that is less. I actually think that is less true now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I think there's been more of an openness towards varied repertoire, but there are certain jurisdictions that do really expect, and you just don't go into a Greek church and not hear Byzantine chant. You're not going to hear Slavic chant in a Greek church. Well, except mine, because I'm technically under the Greek Archbishop, and we do Byzantine chants, we do Serbian chant, we do all kinds of chant, but we're peculiar. We are not a Greek ethnic community.
Well, let me. Oops. Yes, that was smooth. Let me ask a couple of questions and then open it up to everybody else. One of the themes that I found common between you was this notion that the music has to be appropriate to the people who are assembled for worship. And so Protestant hymns in a Latino parish don't make a lot of sense, or Slavic tunes in a Greek setting don't make a lot of sense. That somehow it has to connect with people and their comfort zone. Hence the question, what does it mean to try and expand the comfort zone? What role does liturgical music play at challenging preconceptions, at pushing people in certain directions? And this certainly happened after Vatican II in some rather strong ways. I don't think there's anything quite comparable in the Orthodox tradition. But how would you address that? Because you obviously have introduced Slavic tunes in a Greek setting. And Tony, I mean, I've been to a number of the liturgies here where I don't know that I would say you've pushed the boundaries, because I'm not exactly sure what the boundaries are at a university setting. But within Catholic parishes in general, what does it mean both to attend to the comfort zone of the people and yet also to move into new directions? In 2 minutes or less.
First.
Well, obviously one huge consideration being at Loyola Marymount versus, maybe even another parish in Los Angeles, which might be more culturally similar, is the fact that, I guess I just shut up altogether, is the fact that I'm looking out at that assembly and looking at all of the great diversity that's there. So while I may be pushing some people, but for other people it is their home way of praying. Like for instance, singing a ranchera as the gathering song might be somewhat shocking to my boss. But it's not going to be shocking to, the 20% of students who are Latino at LMU.
But I think your point is well taken, which is we can't just say, well, you're comfortable with this, so that's all we're ever going to do. I think what I'm trying to say is there needs to be sort of a pastoral realization that needs to take place, which often doesn't. So, people, we need to learn, some chant at least. You don't know any chant, rather than before they've even gotten to know that community, or the flip. And so I think a lot of it, in terms of, I think we do have a responsibility to also keep moving forward. Or maybe in some communities, it is retrieving certain things that have been completely lost, which may be helpful to the way in which we pray. But I think a lot of it has to do with the way in which it's done and doing it I think we talked about this a little bit in our conversation, a little piece at a time.
So I need to clarify, although we're technically a Greek parish, we didn't start out that way. It's just where we happen to be at the moment.
Started out evangelical Protestant?
Yeah, it's a long and complex history, which we don't need to go into here. But we are a parish that's very culturally diverse, although the majority of the parish are American converts, and many American converts from evangelicalism. But the trick is, and as a skilled musician, you get to know this, what are the characteristics of a musical setting that are actually the things that people are hanging on to? It may not be just that it's Byzantine chant or just that it's Russian. It may be the style in which something is set. And as a liturgical musician, you have to be sensitive to that. And sometimes we get it wrong. I remember 10 or 15 years ago trying to introduce a new setting of Let My Prayer Arise in the pre-sanctified liturgy. I was sure that the congregation would love it. I rehearsed the men, they sang it beautifully. It was so moving. It fell on its face. We didn't even try it a second time because it just, for whatever reason, in that liturgical moment, it didn't work, even though it appeared to have all the appropriate trappings. So it's a little bit of trial and error. Sometimes with our parish, when we make changes, we let them know, by the way, we're going to be using a new anaphora setting on Sunday, and after Vespers on Saturday night, we're going to just sing through it so that the first time you hear it isn't in liturgy. So that, and sometimes we might do that for a couple of Saturday nights before we actually sing it, because that's something we do want the gathered faithful to enter into and sing with. And if it's a new setting, you don't want that very critical moment liturgically, for them to go, oh, what's that? You know, you want them to be prepared for that. So it's, you know, you have to simply be sensitive. I would say you just have to be sensitive. You have to work with your priest on it, and, you know, and maybe education. Sometimes explaining to the faithful, well, the reason we're not doing that particular setting anymore is because here's how it didn't meet the liturgical needs of the moment. And when they understand that, then sometimes we'll sing that at some gathering, but not during church.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, let me open it up to all of you for your comments and questions. And Kat, you have a mic that's going to circulate, or people will come out? Okay. Please.
I don't know if this.
Give it a shot.
Yeah.
It's on.
Thank you very much, both Tony and Alice. And if this is redundant, you can ignore the question, but for Alice and then Tony in the same vein, you were mentioning about a common style. If we look at the title of the conference, towards a local church or towards an American church, a single jurisdiction church, and even though many of us are familiar with the beautiful music of people like Bailey and Morrison and Father Sergei and others, would it be of great benefit, and is it ever going to be possible for us to have a single, just like we have the St. John Chrysostom liturgy, as a thing that unifies us throughout the world? In America, would it be significant to have a single setting that even the Episcopal College of Bishops would adopt to bring us a sense of unity, as it does in the Byzantine churches with their basic 8-tone liturgies, and the Russian churches with their basic 8-tone liturgies? Would that help? And I would ask the same question of Tony. Is that something the College of Bishops would adopt in order to provide a sense of unity among Catholics?
Well, Phil, I'd have to say no. I do think it's possible for there to be some commonality. I think the biggest hurdle for that is the translation issue, which is not something we're addressing here. It's very hard to have a flowering of Orthodox composition when, a composer might compose it to a particular text, and then someone in a parish that uses a different kind of language can't use it. The liturgical translation issue is a huge issue, and that's not going to be resolved for some time. And I'll be honest, I have very differing opinions about that, because on the one hand, although I would love uniformity of language, I'm very skittish about changing the way people pray. The way that they have learned to pray, and changing that language out from underneath them. I feel strongly that that's not necessarily advisable. So.
I'm really happy we're not talking about liturgical translation this morning. I think there has been some, hope. Where'd you go, Phil? There you are. There's been some, movement or encouragement, maybe within particular dioceses, to learn a particular setting of the ordinary of the Mass. Some people have advocated that everyone should know all of the ordinary of the Mass, the new chant, the revised chant versions. I think linguistically that's hard, stylistically that's hard. And as I said, I think my criteria at the end of a Roman Catholic liturgy is how did this music serve the liturgical rites and engage that assembly in full participation. And I would love to be able to walk into a Black Catholic church in Chicago, and to walk into a church in East LA and in my home state of Minnesota, and be able to recognize qualities of the music and the participation and the way it serves the rites, but the way it's adorned, the actual style can be vastly different.
I agree.
Thank you. Please.
First of all, thank you very much for the engaging presentations. I'd like to cancel my talk and just have more conversation on this because, to confess, I converted to Orthodoxy 15 years ago. Before that, I was a worship leader in an evangelical Protestant context and a songwriter signed to a record label in Nashville. And then have a whole other side of my family that's Roman Catholic. And so it's just, I have a really bizarre mix. I wanted to bring out something though for your comment. I sensed, even in some quotes that I wrote down today, but I sensed this more just sort of anecdotally as I've traveled around with the work that I've done the last 3 years to many, many different parishes, that we have two different perspectives. And it comes out even in what you call yourselves. We call ourselves liturgical musicians. You call yourself a pastoral musician. It's interesting to me. I also heard, Allison, I heard you mention each people group and then each parish has a musical history that's important, the peculiarities of the situation. We don't just select what we like, we match liturgical form and function and the ethos, etc. to the parish. Now, I studied with Bailey for 3 years at St. Vladimir's, and so text is king. I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying. I'm drinking from the same well. However, I heard something different though. When you were speaking though, Tony, you know, that who are the people that are coming? What's the culture, the age, the language, the education that needs to be considered? My experience has been that in the Orthodox Church, we're concerned about making sure that the people who are already there continue to pray. And pray in a way that's conducive to their prayer, don't mess with people's piety, and that maybe we stretch them a little bit. My Roman Catholic friends, and I have a lot of them who are musicians, we're all evangelicals, and some of us went Orthodox, and some of us went Catholic, you know. It's true. I mean, we all still stay in touch, and you know, for a while there I had a group that I was trying to start called Co-Create, which was going to try to bring these things together, but anyway, then I discovered Psalm and dropped all that. But, the point that I'm trying to get at here that I'd like to have you all talk about is there a sense that a modern Roman Catholic musical tradition is influenced deeply, particularly by John Paul and Pope John Paul and his emphasis on missiology in this modern context versus Orthodoxy that's still trying to, in its adolescence, discover who it is and figure out kind of, you know, the zits on our face and where are we going to live and where are we going to go to college. I mean, we don't have a maturity, I don't believe, as an Orthodox community in America. And I think I'd like to hear you all both comment on this subtle but important difference that I picked up in the two talks.
Or you could sing a song from your Nashville days instead.
No thanks. Those CDs make really good like coffee coasters.
First, I'd like to comment on one of the things you said early about the Orthodox worrying about taking care of the people that are there, as opposed, I assume, to bringing people in. And I would just say in my own ministry, that's actually not my concern. Yes, I am concerned about the people that are there, but when I make new musical choices, it's usually about when someone comes here as a visitor, how will they react? Will they feel welcome? So it's not totally just taking care of who's there, but that is important. Yeah, we are in our infancy. Adolescence. Okay, we'll take adolescence. And as we know, adolescents, I teach high school, feel very strongly about their position. And I think that's what we're seeing a little bit in Orthodoxy right now. I think that's why, compared to, say, 10 or 15 years ago, dialogue between jurisdictions was easier. And I had never thought of it that way, but you may be right. We might be just hanging on to our, trying to, I don't know, the thing that adolescents do. But I'm starting to see more of a blossoming of music, which I find very encouraging, and less resistance, at least in some quarters, to new composition, because ultimately the music we use in worship in the U.S. needs to be a reflection of who we are as a people. And who we are as a people are widely varied. And so I think that the musical tradition that grows up will be widely varied.
I don't know that I really want to answer your question, but I will say that I feel that Roman Catholics are in their infancy too, in terms of figuring out what this Vatican II called for. And people that think we're, somehow know what it is at this point, or those who are ready to just give up on it because they say it hasn't worked or it was just a grand experiment. I think we're just so amazingly young at it. We're still trying to figure out what participation really is for us. So I don't know that I would agree that we're any more along the way.
I'd like to just offer, and then I'll sit down, one amazing experience I've had in the last 3 years. There's a woman who I had the privilege of burying day before yesterday, 71-year-old African-American Orthodox Christian named Matushka Thelma and Alshol, and she went by Michaelia. And Michaela did this amazing kind of holy foolish thing, and I think it should be commented on at some point in time. I'd love to talk to you about it, Allison, but she would, after the end of the baptism, this is just one example, we normally read Psalm 33 or chant it in tone 8, something like that. Then we kind of stand around and wait for something, or maybe the choir starts again. She, from her African-American tradition as a convert to Orthodoxy, would just start singing, "Wade into the water, wade into the water, children, wade." And it was like, oh, it was unbelievable. And I would love to hear you all talk more later, perhaps, about why we can't be more daring in our enculturation. If we know the rules of engagement, that text is king, that we have to have congregational singing, can't we pull upon shape note music and the old Negro spirituals and, create in me a clean heart, O God, that I sang as a kid growing up, and why are we so afraid to do that? And oftentimes I always hear, well, look what happened after Vatican II. Well, have you looked at what happened after Vatican II? There are more Orthodox Christians in Archangel Michael Parish than in all of the Orthodox Christians in all the Orthodox Christians in Kansas. There are more people in one Catholic parish than all the Orthodox Christians in Kansas. I don't know, just something that I wanted to comment. Thank you for the opportunity.
We'll certainly talk more about that. Yes?
Sounds like lunch.
Please.
I am Athanasios Perry, an ordinary Orthodox convert. I've lived because I am somewhat challenged, I've been unable to drive most of my adult life and have been in the lower echelon of the economic status. I've lived all over Los Angeles and involved in several years at a time in Romanian parishes, Greek parishes, Antiochian parishes, OCA, Slavonic parishes. I was chrismated originally under Father Sergei Gogolyev in St. Innocent's. And I want to throw a different spin on this. I want to talk to you about the frustrations and problems of the musically challenged. Now, choirs love to show off their voices. And I've lived in many churches where what happened was an ecclesiastical concert. They would sing the cherubic hymn so polyphonically that you couldn't figure out where you were in any part of it. So I developed a strategy of turning them off and concentrating on no one is able to serve and to serve you who are weighed down with the problems of this life. The prayer the priest prays. I find by making one change in it, instead of I, who am gifted with this ordination, to pray for him who is gifted with the grace of the ordination. I could pray the whole prayer, but it closed you out. Those of us who are not musically gifted, those of us who find extreme polyphony and other things hard to follow and impossible to participate in, I question the validity of that kind of music in the liturgy. Because the function of music in the liturgy and the function of the choir, from my understanding, is to lead the congregation in worship. And when you're so far ahead of me that you're running away, you're not leading me. And I wonder if you're cognizant of and dealing with that kind of problem, because I suspect there are far more of those people in your congregations than you people are aware of.
Thank you.
The issue of the appropriateness of certain polyphonic settings is, you're absolutely right. It needs to engage the people, and the people need to be able to respond. That's probably one of the biggest things that I work on is, will this setting engage people on the places where the people need to respond? Can they respond? Can they actually enter into the prayer and sing the Lord have mercies, or the troparion of the day that we sing, 15 times if you go to every service? Can they enter into that? And it's very important. And if it's leaving you cold, find someplace else to go, because there's plenty of places where you can be engaged.
Tony? The safe way out. Okay. Please.
No, please. Just a short comment, and both of you. From the Roman Catholic experience, lately in particular, I would wonder, I'd like to hear some reflections actually about, in a general way, about, on the one hand, translation and music there, because even that,
You're not going to escape the translation question.
even the question about getting a sort of revised chant going with this new translations. To me, one of the problems is the translations are so poor you can't sing to them. The revised chant is so insipid you wouldn't want to sing it. And nobody is really thinking about who is this church here now before us. And so it raises also the questions about, I think it was you, Tony, talking about traditionalism without context and history. That raises that question, I think, very, very seriously. And then look at what happened after Vatican II. Well, one of the problems is, of course, Vatican II's still beginning in some ways in terms of its enculturation, its appropriation, its implementation. And I can't believe myself that this about-face at the moment has any lasting power. Enough to ruin a generation or two, perhaps, but in the long run, maybe not much longer. But in the meantime, if you have some reflections on some of those things, translation, the kind of music, what makes prayer. The first time I heard the new translation in Advent, I came out saying, wow, this is not English and it's not prayer. And the same thing happens with a lot of music at the moment.
Comments? Yeah, translation is a huge issue, and I think, for one thing, I think the process was a huge issue for people. For those of you who don't know, this new translation of the Roman Missal has been imposed on the Roman Catholic Church.
Did you say imposed?
As opposed to what? Voted on? Implemented. There you go. I guess it depends on your perspective. But actually, one of the interesting things, particularly about the chant settings, is even in that, and you would think that people would want excellent chant, even regardless of putting aside for the second whether the words are good or not, you'd think you'd want excellent chant. But actually some of the foremost chant scholars in the United States who were consulted initially essentially got thrown aside in the end. People like Anthony Ruff in Collegeville, who felt he had to leave the process because for a variety of reasons. But you end up, and just as an example to what Dr. Cartman, right, is saying, is, I'll give you one brief musical example of the Sanctus in the new missal. It goes, holy, holy. And anyone knows that anyone who would set church music would always begin with the text and realize that the phrase is holy, holy, holy. And even in that small example, you can see the word accent is in the complete wrong place, regardless of whether you like chant, whether you like music or not. But holy, holy. I mean, how anyone can think that chant, which is extolled for its virtue to reflect the text and not detract from it, to follow the natural accents of the text, which is an argument used against a lot of more contemporary music, doesn't do that at all with the new translation. So it's particularly hard, to go back to your question, to get behind wanting that to be a normative setting when it's so flawed.
Tell us what you really think.
Well, it's not what I mean, anyway, I think we can all agree. I mean, I set a lot of music in Spanish too, and I've made the error at times, even though my dad is Cuban, and having some experience of the language of placing things in the wrong place, accents in the wrong place, and it's so jarring to people, and it doesn't allow them to participate in the way they need to.
It's jarring, but it also distorts the meaning of the text. And that's a huge problem with many of the Orthodox settings that are so commonly used. The distortion of the text because of how it's set into the melody is just atrocious. Oh, and I don't feel strongly about that.
Okay. We have about 5 minutes left, and so let me go ahead, and we have 3 more questions, comments. Let me ask that they be succinctly stated and succinctly answered.
Aye, sir. Since we serve in a military setting, we're privileged to, in many ways, be able to transcend jurisdictionality in our Orthodox worship, which is a fabulous thing for me because I can throw any sort of music out there. And since our congregation changes, I'm not held to what's mom's meatloaf in many parishes. So it's a great thing. But one thing that really is a consideration is the use of music as evangelization. In San Diego, we have the Pan-Orthodox Vespers for Sunday of Orthodoxy, and this has become a way that we are able to actually share our faith with those in the community. And we have a community choir that sings, and the music is, I don't think any of us have the best choirs. Vlad has a wonderful choir, but which is the nucleus of what we do, but presenting that beauty and the diversity of cultures, because this particular service embraces all of the different things that we bring to the Orthodox faith. It provides a great witness to those who are not Orthodox and plants a seed for them. We have every Sunday recruits that come to our chapel that are by and large not Orthodox or not even churched. And they come and they're singing. They're not singing because I give them the music, I give them the words, and they have to listen to my poor and pathetic attempt at liturgy. But they take part in the conversation and take part in the prayer. And I think that's important.
This is where I leap in.
Yes.
Is there a question or is there a point?
Well, yeah, I'm sorry. I just think that there are examples where these things are put together and we just don't know about them.
Okay,
So
I will take that as a point made.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes.
I'll make mine as short as possible. I don't know if Alice...
Time's up.
I don't know if Alice can answer this, but my wife and I have gone to a lot of Catholic funerals and other Protestant funerals, and they have such beautiful hymns that the Orthodox Church will not accept or will not use. And I'm wondering, maybe some of the Orthodox priests could answer that particular question. I love some of those hymns.
Okay.
And they are so beautiful.
So
But
why
they don't use them in the.
Here, I can speak to that. Of course, the Orthodox funeral service itself has beautiful hymnography, some of the most beautiful. But at our parish, when we go to the graveside, after the body is put in the ground and the faithful then shovel the dirt, the choir sings all manner of different music, and many times things that are close to the heart of the family that is there. So at that point, when we're outside of the church, we often do sing hymns from other traditions at that time. And I think that's a good way to do it.
So it can happen. And we'll leave the last comment question for Father Radu.
My question is, who is the celebrant of the liturgy? And let me explain what I mean by that. When we write theologically, it's okay for us to say that it's Jesus Christ, first of all, and then there is the priest together with the community, there are some angels who are coming together with us. When it comes to speak practically, it seems to me that there is a little bit of competition between these categories. Well, no one can compete with Jesus, but between the priest,
They try.
between the priest and the choir and the congregation, there seems to be a competition, including in the way it was reflected in your talks, it seems to me. The choir is the angelic part, then the congregation sings. And then one thing we haven't talked about is the priest is really supposed to say many prayers during the Orthodox liturgy, and sometimes because we want to hear the beautiful choir or congregational singing, we're going to make those prayers silent. Is there a competition, and who is the celebrant of the liturgy?
I don't think there has to be a competition. I hear what you're saying, though. I think often there does seem to be. Bishop Basil Essie of the Antiochian Archdiocese, one time when he was giving a talk, actually at one of our liturgical singing seminars, he said, and I will always remember this, that we have to remember when we're in church that we are jumping into something that is happening continuously in the heavens. The angels are continuously praying, and the liturgy doesn't begin with "Blessed is the kingdom" and end with "through the prayers." It's happening. We just simply enter in for a time with what's going on in the heavens. And if we make sure that we're acknowledging that, then perhaps it's a little bit humbling and there's less of an argument.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our two speakers. I trust this rich conversation will continue over lunch.
Thank you to everyone. I'm going to have the last word. Nicholas Afanasiev and Trapeza Gospodnia, basically a book on the Eucharist, which has yet to be published, says that the laity is the concelebrant of the liturgy, which you will also find in many documents of the Second Vatican Council. And all of these discussions can be continued at lunch, to which we warmly invite you. And if you want to know where to go, it's in the same place as yesterday, up in the third floor. You can follow Catherine out the door. But thanks again. We will reconvene today at, I believe, 1:30 for the next session. So let's go to lunch.
I want to thank the Institute and LMU for inviting me here, and thank all of you for being here. The title of this is "The Church Has Left the Building." And I just want to say at the outset, when I talked about this at a gathering not too long ago, as soon as people heard that, they thought, and they told me later on, they thought I was going to be nothing but discouraging and preaching doom, and that's not the point. This is to talk about what's going on the ground in parishes, not just Orthodox ones, but many other denominations in the United States for demographic reasons. I didn't create this title, which is a very cool one, "The Church Has Left the Building," which uses a little bit of current slang. I did find it in the Religious News Service, and there it referred to emerging churches being unwilling to spend all their time and resources keeping a building open, keeping a roof on the building, replacing the furnace, etc. you're going to hear Michael Horan, my good colleague here, talk about leaving the building more in the sense of leaving a community of faith, and that is another way in which the church is leaving the building. But my discussion of it is all about the material building, and to some extent also people leaving because of other demographic factors. I think all of us know that the church is not the building. The body of Christ is the church, the people of God, that constitutes the church. We distinguish between the Una Sancta and the many denominations. We distinguish between the Church of God in Christ, as St. Paul called it, and the many local churches. And we know the difference between a building, which might be a temple or a basilica, and the household of faith, the koinonia, that is contained within it, the people. The two are not in opposition to one another, but the one does need the other. I mean, if you have a community, you have to have a location. Real estate is quite correct. Location, location, location. Over the years, the church has been in lots of different kinds of buildings. It's been in the homes of people like Andronicus and Junia, Aquila and Priscilla, and Lydia, Phoebe. It's been in rented space in Thessaloniki. It's been in all kinds of locations in Damascus, Rome, Alexandria, Constantinople, Baghdad, and in our own time we've seen the church located in mission parishes. The church has been in Jerusalem squares. It's been on a seashore where people gather to pray. We know of the house church in Dura Europos that's been excavated and studied. We know about house churches in the 1960s, and we know about emerging churches and mission parishes today. So the church cannot be said to have completely left the building, but what I'm trying to talk about here are the effects of a whole bunch of demographic changes on church buildings and parish communities in the late 20th and in the 21st century. These are challenges, but by no means should one be pessimistic, because the church, as the Lord promised, will abide. And if you read Dartmouth McCulloch's wonderful history of Christianity the first 3,000 years, he reminds you of all the various ways in which the church has been housed and where it's resided. The great ecclesiologist of the last century, Nicholas Afanasieff, said about 70 years ago that the New Testament locates the church in the world. The church, quote, faces the world, abides in the world, and builds in the world till the fullness of time. That, I take as a statement of great faith in the church, and not to worry about the church leaving the building. But if one were to look at the huge body of data gathered about religious membership, religious belief, religious participation here in the 21st century, one might get a little concerned. If you look at the studies, the 2008 Pew U.S. Religious Landscape, which used a sample of over 35,000, back when that was published, all the papers, the rest of the media got very alarmed because one of the findings was how many people are leaving the religion of their origin, the church in which they grew up. And also, most importantly, how many people are turning themselves into or are identifying themselves as religious nuns, and not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. They have no particular religion. And just as a side to this, it's an interesting thing when people do survey research on religion. Lots of people will tell you that they believe in God, a higher power, a deity. Lots of people will tell you that they pray, even daily. Then it gets interesting. Do you belong to a community of faith? And that's where not only this religious landscape survey of 2008, but other studies, the Decade of Change by the Hartford Institute, 2000 to 2010, Mark Chavez's American Religion Contemporary Trends, published in 2011, also his study, American Congregations at the Beginning of the 21st Century, and the American Grace Study by Putnam and Campbell, are all telling us that while the United States of America remains an intensely religious country, there is, and I'm going to summarize now, decline and change going on. Many congregations across the board again, Catholic, Orthodox, mainstream Protestant, are aging. The economic crisis, or Great Recession of 2008, has had a very profound impact on local congregations. Then there are other demographic changes. People are not marrying the same people they used to marry. They're marrying out, in many cases, of their language or ethnic group. They're marrying across church and even across religious lines. And they're increasingly doing this in the last 100 years. But the basic question when it comes to demographics is actually even more basic than that. Marriage would be an important part of it. But who are we anymore? I mean, where do we live? Where do we work? Where do our children go to school? Now, if you stop and think of that, just asking yourself about your family and your friends and your own self, then connect that to the many churches, for example, built by immigrants in the last 100 years. To cut to the chase, in many cases, a lot of them are now declared redundant. Do you need a Polish, a Slovak, a Hungarian, an Irish, an Italian, a German Catholic parish within blocks of one another? Do you need this kind of Norwegian synod, another kind of Norwegian, and a third kind of Norwegian Lutheran church within eyesight of one another in parts of Brooklyn? In many of the old industrial cities and towns of the Northeast and the Midwest, where so many Eastern European immigrants settled, one of our interns took a parish in Frackville, Pennsylvania, right on the border of the coal region, where my father's family came from and where my uncle served as a Greek Catholic priest for over 50 years. When he told me Frackville, I said, well, you're going to be the first onion dome off the interstate. There are 5 more. Onion domes, meaning Eastern, Orthodox, and Catholic churches. That's not even to count the 2 or 3 or 4 Roman Catholic parishes, the Lutheran, the Episcopal, the Presbyterian, the Methodist, the Baptist, and all of this in a town of now less than 2,500 people. Well, why? This is an icon or an image of what I'm talking about. There used to be thousands more people living there when there were mines. Just as in Ohio, just as in parts of Michigan, just as in lots of New England, there were thousands of immigrants, Catholic, Orthodox, Greek Catholic, who came to work in the mines and the mills and the factories. All those mines, mills, and factories are long since gone, particularly in the coal region of northeastern Pennsylvania, which used to be called the Holy Land by both the Eastern Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. The mines are long closed, the immigrants are long gone, but so are their children, their grandchildren, and in some cases even their great-grandchildren, because there's no work there. Now, let me just interject at this point. I'm not just talking about the Rust Belt. I'm not just talking about places where immigrants went. Because where I live in the Hudson Valley today, it's an old part of the country, very close to the Connecticut border. Every one of our tiny hamlets and villages still has standing an Episcopal parish, a Presbyterian parish, a Methodist parish, possibly a Catholic parish. All now within 5 minutes drive of one another, but in a former time, maybe a half a day's journey by foot or horse or cart. And so in the case even of mainstream American churches, there is now, because of demographic factors, a multiplication of parishes that have a hard time existing. So just as the parish in Frackville that our intern went to, he finds himself in a situation where there is no possibility for growth, and there's a real big building to keep open. And so the few people who are left there are baking nut rolls and making pierogi to try to keep the place open. And then what becomes of his ministry? Well, he celebrates the Eucharist, he ministers to them in every possible way, but clearly he's in a situation where the church is leaving the building. Or you could even reverse it and say the building is leaving the church. Now, there isn't a lot of data because there haven't been a lot of studies on these demographic changes to the church. We don't yet know, except from studies within a few church bodies like the ELCA and the American Episcopal Church, some of the things that they've been doing to adapt. And this is a whole other area which I can't talk in great detail about. But for example, one of the most common things you'll find is a pastor now taking care of not one, not two, but in some cases in rural areas, 3 and 4 formerly independent autonomous parishes that have now been yoked together into a regional parish. That's a strategy that's been employed, I know, by the Lutherans, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and others for over 40 years now. In my own little town where I get on the train to go to New York City, there are 3 churches. One of them has a weekend priest who comes up for the city, the Episcopal Church. The Presbyterian has a lay pastor who has finished all of his seminary training and is waiting to get ordained, but who has a full-time job. That's the worker priest model. And then the third, the Methodist, has a quarter time. Now she's all there, fully there. Very wonderful Korean-American woman, but she can only be paid a quarter time. And the parish now is so small that it probably only really requires Sunday morning and another day during the week. Whereas most people get very concerned about people leaving a particular denomination, or children or grandchildren no longer going to church. What I'm talking about is something a little bit more objective. I'm not so much talking here about people leaving the church in anger or leaving the church because of doctrinal or liturgical disagreements, but I'm talking about the fact that former viable parishes are no longer sustainable. So this is all coming out of a lot of anecdotal information that I've collected from our former interns. Father Deacon Nicholas was an intern in our parish. Every year we have one. When Father Justin and his wife were there, we had 3 young priests, student priests, interns. So over the years we've had now many, many interns who leave us when they graduate and then go out to various kinds of ministry. In fact, Father Justin and Father Nicholas are 2 of the people who I've asked to maybe write with me, firsthand accounts of their experience doing ministry in an academic setting, in social outreach, in parish settings. This is the kind of approach that I would like to take to the study. But if you're going to ask me, and I'm sure somebody is going to when I'm done, what do we do about this? The thing that I'm going to have to say is that there is no recipe, one size fits all. In fact, there are some very interesting and very hopeful things that people have done to try to deal with parishes that are no longer sustainable. The emerging churches, for example, are ones in which renting space, either from another church or simply commercial space that they can use, being a viable parish without all of the overhead, if you will, the edifice complex. Mission parishes, at least in their early stages, their early days, when they're renting a space, or maybe even using somebody's home. These are very instructive. Typically, the ideal is to get big enough so that you can build your own building and then have to deal with that. But the mission parish is another place where one could look for attempts to deal with what is happening demographically to our parishes. Another one that I know of well, because it's where I serve, is the regional parish, where no longer do you have people walking down the lane to hear the church bells for services, but in fact coming from, in our case, I think 4 or 5 counties, and maybe more than a dozen school systems, because ours is the only English language Orthodox parish in that part of the Hudson Valley. There is a Greek parish, there's a Rocor parish, we're the only ones who are English speaking. And yet there are others. I know at least of a couple of cases where people have decided to try to find an alternative. A colleague of mine some years back, rather than buy, he was encouraged to buy a church that was on the market that turned out to be way past their ability to mortgage. They found what was essentially an old pizza restaurant, gutted it, turned it into a beautiful worship area, church, and then a place for education and for fellowship. So rather than try to, as most institutional church people would like, to give prescriptions and ideas for what to do, I think what I'm hearing from clergy colleagues and from our former interns is, those who are in situations, can best tell us what has worked for them and what has not worked for them. One other interesting element here is, will the parish community of the future in not these basilica-type, cathedral-type buildings look any different? And the answer is yes, because we can already see this from emerging church parishes and from mission parishes. For one thing, I think the community character, the koinonia character, is leading, is dominant. It isn't just the priest or the pastor that's going to make this church. It's the community as a whole. Just as Afanasieff tells us, the entire community celebrates the Eucharist, hears the Word of God, tries to live it, tries to then put it into practice in their lives. So too, in the day-to-day ongoing life of the parish, there's going to be a much more and a much richer participation. The numbers will be smaller. The old clerical versus lay battles, which in many Eastern churches clouded the past, are not going to be there. And each parish is going to take on a whole set of characteristics of its own. It's not going to be different in liturgy necessarily or belief from others, but it's going to take on the character of that community in that part of the country. It's going to be its own kind of parish, even though it's part, obviously, in communion of a diocese, a deanery, a diocese, a larger church body. People in such parishes are going to necessarily need to be more engaged. The idea of letting the church council do it, letting the church school staff do it, letting the choir do it, those kinds of lines with smaller communities are going to make it impossible to have that kind of idea that I can be a free rider, that I can just be passive and let somebody else do the organization, the singing, the teaching, the funding, the work. And I think also too, from the point of view of ordained ministry, it might also be the case that we're going to find clergy going back to the models of the earlier church, the worker priest model, or at least some kind of work along the side. Something that our interns tell us, and those of us who are in such situations, who have a day job like myself, that this is not such a bad thing. It makes you aware of the pressures on a spouse, on a parent, on children, when you're thinking of scheduling yet another study group in the evening, or a choir practice in the middle of the week, or even scheduling and the times and the scheduling of services. You may have to find a typicon that works for you. So to conclude, this is a project sort of still in process. What I hope to do is not so much of a survey study, but a very intense first-person account. I've asked a number of people, 2 of them here, to contribute. I've asked a few more who are still pondering it, but it would be good to get the actual experiences of some who have been in situations. The young man who I told you was called to a parish in Frackville has now ended up in an inner city parish in Philadelphia in the process of trying to revive it. And because of his gifts in ministry and his vision, he is doing that. His people have said, we want to now get to know the neighborhood. We want to be part of the life not only of those who live around us, but even of the other Christians. He's not been afraid to join the local clergy association. He's not afraid of praying with heretics. I say that sarcastically. So that's basically what I wanted to put before you. It could sound at first very pessimistic, but in fact, you know, it really is part of the life, of the ongoing history and life of the church. We weren't always in cathedrals and basilicas. Amen.
We'll hold questions until both of the speakers have given their papers, and then have the speakers discuss their papers between the two of them, and then open the floor up to questions from all of you. Our second speaker today is Michael Horan. Dr. Horan is Professor of Religious Education and Pastoral Theology here at LMU. So many of you know him. And he has recently served as the chair of the Department of Theological Studies here at LMU. Dr. Horan holds a PhD from Catholic University of America, and his work has been largely in the field of the preparation of lay ministers for leadership in the Catholic Church. So I will invite Dr. Horan to come up and give his paper, Before the Church Leaves the Building, Is Intra-Parish Dialogue Possible?
Thank you very much. I really am delighted to be here, and I've learned so much since yesterday morning. It's really been a wonderful conference, so thank you to all those who planned it and supported it. It's just excellent. I speak this afternoon as a Catholic pastoral theologian, so I'm always interested in trying to interpret the pastoral situation, to use something from the tradition to illuminate, to help me to understand it, and I hope to help all of us to understand it. My reflections focus on the need for interreligious dialogue and ecumenical conversation, but I'm going to apply those two terms to Catholics. I think these reflections are designed to help us consider two trends or two realities, and related to those two trends, two proposals that could function as helpful conversation starters this afternoon. At least I hope they will help all of us to have some direction for some future pastoral praxis within and beyond Catholicism. I claim no expertise in Orthodoxy, but I suspect that some of the comments that I have to make about Catholics either stand parallel to or may find some resonance with the concerns of pastoral leaders in this room, and I take that to mean all of us, because anyone who would do this on their weekend is already a pastoral leader, deeply committed to coming out in the rain to talk about important realities, but realities that don't seem to attract a whole lot of other folks. So the first trend or reality that I want to talk about is the growth of secular Catholicism, a very large movement in the United States. That's clearly about the church that has left the building. What some Catholics have called lapsed Catholics, inactive, bad, relativistic, illiterate, ex-Catholics, some writers are calling secular Catholics. And I'd like to consider that trend or reality first. Michael, you already helped us to see the Pew Forum Religious Landscape Survey. One very chilling stat in that is that about 1 in 10 adults in the United States is a former Catholic. And so I'm using that term former in a general sense to mean all those who may have grown up in Catholicism but have found another home and place to practice their faith. But I'm really more concerned with the secular Catholics who are described by Tom Bedoin, pastoral theologian at Fordham University, in this way. I refer to those with a Catholic heritage, however nominal, who cannot find Catholicism central to the everyday project of their lives, and are in varying degrees of distance from what they take to be normative or prescribed Catholicism. Secular Catholics are typically baptized Catholics who, by the time of adulthood, find themselves having to deal somehow with their cultural Catholicism and do so as an irredeemable aspect of their identity, but whom those in pastoral ministry or academic theology, that's all of us, tend to call non-practicing, nominal, religiously illiterate, etc. Well, when you put that in the context of the larger landscape study of the Pew Forum, and you put it in the context of the text that Michael, you also mentioned, Robert Putnam and David Campbell's work on American Grace, it's one of the things that Putnam and Campbell note is that on average in the United States, people have 2 friends of another faith and 1 extended family member of another faith other than their own. The Catholics that I meet pastorally, and I'm one of them as well, my own stats would concur, I always have Thanksgiving dinner with a secular Catholic, because in my extended family there is at least one person who sort of fits the bill of Tom Bedoin's description. One of the studies that would be helpful to light this up, though, as well, is the study of the Barna Group. The Barna Group research summary done by David Kinnaman in a text, "You Lost Me, Why Young Christians Are Leaving the Church and Rethinking Faith." He and Barna did some exit interviews of Christians, not just Catholics, but Christians of all stripes who left their churches. And by young, he means under the age of 35, but that would certainly be young parents as well of the next generation of kids in our churches. They complain, if they're trying to summarize why they no longer find a particular church meaningful, they have 6 general complaints: overprotective, shallow, anti-science, repressive, exclusive, or doubtless. I think most of those are self-evident, what they must mean by those. But anti-science I found particularly interesting when you consider that John Paul II, the long-standing pope of the late 20th century and early 21st, wrote so much about the relationship between faith and science, faith and reason. One would think that at least the Catholics would have better scores at that than they seem to have at the local level. Some Catholics of a younger age, that is, some among the viable future of the church's membership for any of our buildings, are then more at variance with church teaching than previous Catholic generations. That's clear from Barna, but it's also clear from William D. Antonio, a Catholic sociologist, who has shown the differences among the practices of 3 generations and among the 3 generations of their attitudes, that is, pre-Vatican II, Vatican II, and post-Vatican II. And there's, of course, a need for a 4th generation now. As recently as the last month, America Magazine had an article by Patricia Whitberg in which she reports the downward trend of young Catholic women scoring in the general social survey at par with young Protestant women with respect to their spiritual interest. This is a very interesting change. What she says is that their interest in organized religion and their confidence in churches has dipped, and there is not a similar dip among young Protestant women. While this may mean more women are leaving the building, some Catholics, men and women, defect in place while staying in the building, less likely to agree with the church's teachings on who may be ordained, who may be validly married, gay or straight, and how authority in general works inside a church of any kind. So I want to talk about them in a moment, but first, in talking about those who have left the building, I would like to suggest that we try to make sense of that as pastoral theologians rather than to condemn it. There's a need for a name change from calling such people bad Catholics or inactive Catholics or even ex-Catholics, offering them a name that we've decided goes for them. I guess what I'm asking is, if we change the name to secular Catholics, which is the term that Bedoin uses, would that help us to imagine secular Catholics alongside secular Jews who have been informed by a culture, but who may or may not find the actual religious practices a mode of, or a path to spiritual depth. A game change certainly is needed. It seems to me that Catholics today are more adept at respectful, engaging, non-aggressive conversation with Buddhists and with Hindus than they are with secular Catholics. That is, there is less judgment accorded from Catholics when they talk to Hindus and Buddhists than there is when they talk to the people being described by Bedoin as secular Catholics. What I think is needed is the value of interreligious friendship, as that's been described by those who write on interreligious dialogue, a friendship without ulterior motive of conversion, rather a friendship that allows one to ask the deep questions and to truly listen in humility to the experience of the other. So that's really my first point that I would want to make, is that for the church that has left the building, we might try to listen a little bit more humbly and see if there's something in that experience that is helpful to, and I don't even know what I mean by that, because I don't want to jump to conclusions before we've posed the questions and listened with humility. Bedoin says of secular Catholics, contrary to many Catholic apologists, we do not necessarily know what is happening, and we cannot assign a deficient religious education. That's too convenient a story for us to tell about them, when in point of fact, we've never asked them. So that would be my first hope, is that pastorally, we might engage in the kind of humble listening that would allow us to hear the experience of those who clearly do not find whatever the faith of their childhood was as central to their experience. Now, the second reality is to talk about the rifts inside the building, inside Catholicism, the domestic tensions among those who have not left the building, but who seem somehow to be engaged in tension with each other. Within Catholicism, there are at least two possible ways into this conversation. One is to talk about the conflicting theological interpretations of the epic council, the Second Vatican Council, the defining event of the 20th century for Catholics, which is now going to celebrate its 50th anniversary in October. That's one way in, and then there's a second way in, and that's to talk about the rise of evangelical Catholicism over against liberal Catholicism. So the first way, in his very engaging narrative about the post-sex abuse scandalized Catholic Church in the United States, Peter Steinfels, formerly of the New York Times and now at Fordham University, described 4 approaches to the interpretation of Vatican II. There are 2 extreme approaches. He calls them ultra-conservative on the far right and radical on the far left. But the 2 in between are the 2 that would be occupied most by those who also still occupy the building. The first is the conservative narrative. This bears nearly official status in Catholicism and is certainly the one that seems to be most represented by the thought of the Vatican today, but also the U.S. bishops, I would say, in the main. The council was the work of the Spirit, but it's been badly misrepresented by the media at times, and it's been excessively interpreted by liberal theologians and academics at times, poorly communicated by some restless church leaders. And so the conservative narrative would say this was a great experience, but there's still a lot of interpretation to do and a lot of cleanup on prior interpretation. The liberal narrative, most widely recounted by academics, is that the council was a work of the Spirit, a reaffirmation of the Church's place in modernity by virtue of historical critical thinking, religious liberty being affirmed, and about the Holy Spirit in the world, a grace-filled but sinful world in which grace prevails and Catholic cultures are to be engaged because they're revelatory. Clearly, the 2 dominant interpretations among those who have not left the building are found sort of in these 2 middle positions in Steinfeld's work. The divides manifest themselves most strongly in proportion to the investment in Catholic Church life. So lots of Catholics don't really care about Vatican II and don't even know that much about it. The more involved the Catholic, the more likely that Catholic is to hold a position on the issue of Vatican II and to care about what it meant. We come up with an interpretive tool to talk about Catholic identity underneath practices across this left and right divide. What might we do to find a way in? I suggest the much needed and hopeful starting point can at least be found, hints of it, in reviewing the work of a non-Catholic who admired Catholicism 50 years ago. Fresh home from being one of the few Protestant observers invited to Vatican II, Langdon Gilkey, a professor at the University of Chicago, wrote a text entitled "Catholicism Confronts Modernity." He published it in 1967, and I would suggest its contents are still instructive for Catholics and perhaps for Christians from other sacramental churches. In the work, he argues that a Catholic theological worldview and anthropology differ from and complement a Protestant theological worldview and anthropology. They're not better, but they're different. Gilkey understood that each cousin in the extended Christian family held certain spiritual emphases based on their way of seeing the world and its people. He elaborated his thesis by naming and describing Catholic spiritual emphases as sacramentality, mediation, and communion. Sacramentality, the very notion that God has become one with us in the incarnation, therefore nothing is the same. The sacramental celebrations that spill out from our religious world inform all of our world. Mediation, proceeding from the assumption that God wants us to respond to that which we have seen in grace in the sacramental life and in the revelation of Christ by becoming lovers of the world and its people. And communion, the recognition that we are united in ways that are deeper and more lasting than the eye can see, much below the surface of our human differences. Gilkey's work, now 50 years old, may help Catholics and perhaps others to meet the pressing need to articulate a positively constructed identity that's not over against anybody or anything. Gilkey's language may certainly need translating, but it strikes me that the points of unity on which Catholics agree, according to D'Antonio, that is the Eucharist, Mary is the Mother of God, God present in the poor, could in fact be affirmed using these categories. Gilkey's offering a reflection on spiritual values, but it's a starting point. His is not an exhaustive study of Catholic theology or law or ethics. He wants to isolate and appreciate some features of the Catholic personality. His thesis is consonant with David Tracy's analysis of the Catholic analogical imagination, as opposed to the Protestant dialectical imagination. Consistent, I think, with Andrew Greeley's Catholic imagination text, which elaborates some of Gilkey's insight using art and theater as conversation partners. And recently, Thomas Groom's more popular and accessible What Makes Us Catholic, offering an engaging text, an entry point to this kind of reflection on a distinctively Catholic spirituality without closing it off from the kind of ecumenical conversations that need to take place within the walls of the building, and certainly the kind of interreligious friendship and understanding, the kind of humble listening that should characterize the outreach from the building, at least by Catholics, to this growing number of people in the United States who understand themselves as apart from that tradition. Those are the ones that Bedoin is describing as secular Catholics. The container for Catholic identity, whatever it is, must be sufficiently specific to be meaningful, but sufficiently wide to include Catholics in a now divided theological house that is also multicultural in its makeup and increasingly more diverse, and therefore in its practices. Gilkey's reflection and others like it carry the potential to move beyond mere coexistence. There is a lot of tiptoeing in Catholicism around different ethnic practices that one doesn't understand because one isn't from that ethnic group. The practices of particular ethnic groups are often misunderstood by those outside, but the members of the ethnic group themselves may actually lack a way to step back and reflect on the value of a practice or a custom, other than to assert that it's part of our heritage. It's neither disrespectful and certainly not racist to ask, why? What does this practice actually communicate about the core of the spiritual emphases of the tradition. As a pastoral theologian, I've tried to name two realities that are very much a part of the DNA of Catholicism today, and to call upon some features of theory and tradition that might help to light up and help us to understand and move forward as a faith community with those who have left the building and those who are left behind. Thank you.